Welcome to today's edition of Video Clips, and we'll continue on with our discussion of the coronavirus situation. And I'm going to talk to you, give you notes from an interview with another highly qualified person to talk about this. The first thing I want to do, though, is ask that if you are a medical doctor, nurse practitioner, healthcare researcher, statistician, actuary, anybody who has those types of credentials, I would like for you to, if you are interested, send me an email at pampopper@msn.com, because what we're going to do is build a coalition of people with excellent credentials who will make statements or analyze these data that we can present to public health departments and politicians to start addressing the false panic that has been ensued and the unjustified lockdowns of the population. So if you have those credentials and you want to be helpful, send me an email at pampopper@msn.com. I think we have to get massive numbers of people together to combat this, and then we've got to make sure this never happens again. So today I want to feature comments by Dr. Paul Offit, spelled O-F-F-I-T, in case you want to look him up online. He is the inventor of the rotavirus vaccine, very pro-vaccine doctor. He's a physician, head of the Vaccine Education Center at Philadelphia Children's Hospital, professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He is considered an expert in immunology and neurology, and again, very pro-vaccine and generally not a person to be an outlier, but he is on this issue. These are notes from an online video interview. He's actually done several of them. So, and he talks about different things. I'll try to summarize what I took from the interviews that I watched, but you may want to look these up yourself. He, first of all, says that he echoes what Dr. Katz and many other people are saying, that the collateral damage from this is going to be significant. Massive amounts of joblessness and homelessness and the health risks associated with these types of circumstances, and we're already seeing that. People in Columbus are out of food and out of money. I'm watching this right here. And sooner or later, hungry, desperate people, they don't really listen to shelter in place, particularly when the announcement's been made that all the jails are being emptied out, and they're not putting anybody in jail. So, and the courts are shut down. So it's a pretty low risk thing, being a thief or a vandal or engaging in violence right now. Not much chance unless you kill somebody, anything bad's going to happen. Those are my comments, not Dr. Offit's, but I do want to make it clear that he is also concerned about the collateral damage. He says we never should have shut the schools. They didn't do it in places like Singapore. And in fact, the Centers for Disease Control never suggested that this should be done. He said that one of the problems that we have right now is the rationing of health care, which is having some devastating consequences. People with treatable cancers aren't getting treatment. We have members who are reporting this to us right now. We're deciding who gets care and who doesn't. Transplants aren't being done, and surgeries to preserve eyesight are not being done. In other words, it is amazing what is considered non-essential these days and actually kind of frightening. And of course, people are suffering because they're scared half to death, a panic which he said the public officials have generated. Dr. Offit, like many, addresses the deaths and mathematical models, and he says that it is remarkable to him that anybody would predict 1 million cases in the United States. And this is a quote from one of the interviews I watched. He said, "My gosh, did weaponized smallpox just get sprayed over our country?" He says, for crying out loud, this is a respiratory virus. He says in a country like China with 1.4 billion people, there were 3,000 deaths, a little over 3,000 deaths. We have 330 million people. The last pandemic in 2009 and 10 killed 203,000 worldwide and 12,000 people in the United States. Dr. Offit says that the virus is not as easily transmitted via respiratory route as people think, and the warm weather will make it more and more difficult because the droplets take on water and the humidity, and they drop to the ground and they don't tend to fly through the air quite as much. He says this is already happening in Greece, and we're likely to see less spread of the disease as a result. And he emphasizes again, quote, they are just trying to scare the hell out of the public. He says human coronaviruses come back every year, but sometimes they don't. These novel viruses don't. He says SARS and MERS didn't come back. They were one-offs. And his prediction is that if the coronavirus comes back, it will be pretty mild. He says, for example, it's still circulating in China, but you just don't see widespread deaths. Does infection protect against reinfection? This is an important point that I have made for a long time, that people get immunity from being exposed, and we're actually preventing the herd immunity from happening. And he said that that exposure protects for at least many years, and these viruses are stable and they don't mutate. So anybody who was exposed and recovered will have immunity at least for a good long time. The coronavirus, he says, kills people who are over 70 years old and are obese, diabetic, and have hypertension. It leaves most healthy people and children alone. Of the 24,000 deaths worldwide as of the time of his interview, one of the interviews I watched, he said fewer than 5 children had died. And he pointed out, which I have pointed out in a previous video this week, the fact that one 17-year-old in the United States died, and then they did come clean later and say that it had nothing to do with the virus. He died with it, but not of it. Young, healthy people, generally, Dr. Offit says, will not die of the virus. On the other hand, seasonal flu killed 150 children. And this goes to what I've been saying. The response is completely disproportionate and not warranted. As to the question of why healthcare workers are getting sick, he says they're just exposed more often. The more exposure you have, the more likely you're going to get sick. And they're exposed to people who have the virus all day long. I'm going to do another video clip on this shortly, but he was specifically asked about the problems with testing. So the new test is the Abbott molecular RNA 5-minute test. It's a genetic test, and he says there are 2 problems, one of which is nasal swab or throat swab or subject to sampling error, and the other is the false negative, significant number. So it's virtually useless. As for the polymerase chain reaction testing, or PCR tests, he said they discovered with rotavirus that you'll be contagious for a few days, but you may be PCR positive for 6 months. So what the test tells you is that you were exposed. It doesn't tell you when or whether or not you're contagious. So to consider a person having to be PCR negative in order to say that they're okay to be out and about would not be fair, and it would not be accurate. There are other problems with testing also, but I found it interesting that Dr. Offit, again, who is all for vaccines and very traditional doctor, would point out the shortcomings in these tests, and I will do another video specifically allocated to that. He addresses the issue that has been addressed by so many other doctors, which is the hysteria over projected death rates, which originally with swine flu were projected to be 4%, using the same data that Dr. Ioannidis, which I mentioned earlier this week, used. He said it came down to 0.01%. The denominator, in other words, the number of people infected, was much bigger than people knew. And he says that he feels that when the coronavirus, when we look back on it with serological testing, we will see the same phenomenon, that the death rate really wasn't very high. He was asked specifically how to explain what's going on in China. And he says it's either not that contagious, or there was a much greater percentage of the population that was infected and didn't know about it, so they had herd immunity that prevents spread. And there has been more than one doctor, and I'll make sure that I quote somebody really credible with lots of degrees and all that sort of thing when I bring this information to you, but there are quite a few people writing about the fact that we could have gotten herd immunity if we had not locked everybody down, and having not done that may cause a great problem in the future. But Dr. Offit's personal opinion is that the deal is it's just not that transmissible as everybody thinks. He calls Dr. Fauci out on saying that the comparison of coronavirus to other flu is false equivalence. He said that's ridiculous. It's okay to compare. And seasonal flu actually was a much bigger threat and needs to be placed in context. And he said that one of the big differences between the H1N1 in 2009 and 10 is it killed healthy people or younger people, whereas this one does not. Now, here's what this pro-vaccine guy says about the vaccine. He said it took 20 years to make the rotavirus vaccine. Developing a vaccine is useless unless we're pretty sure that this virus is going to come back. It's not going to be available for this episode anyway, so there's no sense in rushing it. And Ioannidis, as you might remember when I talked about him the other day, is very concerned that corners are going to be cut, standards will be set aside, and Offit basically says we should not do anything like that. Natural infection protects against reinfection, and that will make it possible to make a vaccine, but we're actually, we're just trying to prevent this from happening, natural infection from happening. And we're just beginning the process. Now, one of the things that he cautions against, which I thought was very interesting, is that the vaccine will probably be given to people who are not likely to die from the virus. So we have to be careful due to the possibility of immune enhancement, which means that a person who gets the vaccine is then later exposed to the virus, and you end up with a person who actually gets worse or dies. And he said there's a long history of this with vaccines that are rushed to market. One of them was RSV in the 1960s, measles vaccine in 1963. He cited several cases in which rush to get a vaccine out there turned out to be disastrous and actually killed people. Well, all in all, Dr. Offit's take on all of this is very similar to that of Ioannidis and Katz and others. He's concerned about the overreaction, the stupid and unjustified strategies inducing panic, and the collateral damage that is already underway based on locking everybody down. And while we're on the topic of vaccines, don't forget the short, condensed vaccine course affordable to everybody that I'm offering on April 24th. If you're interested, send me an email at pampopper@msn.com, and I'll provide details. As usual, pass this on to people who you think would benefit from watching it. Stay safe and stay sane. I've started adding that to my sign-off. Stay safe and stay sane in the midst of this unprecedented insanity, and let's hope it's over soon. Thank you for watching.